I started learning PHP in the late 1990s with version 3, and since then, even all these years later, it is still the most approachable server-side language and platform in the world. But by being one of those quote old folks in this industry, I can shamelessly say that I envy newcomers, because today's PHP is very different than the PHP I started with. I am Jeremy McPeak with Envato Tuts Plus, and I'm going to show you some of the features I wish PHP had all those years ago. But first, if you want to create a professional website or add features to make your website stand out, then head over to Code Canyon. It is the marketplace for high-quality JavaScript and PHP components, HTML5 and mobile templates, and so much more. The items at Code Canyon can help you easily add the functionality and eye-popping visuals that you need to meet your business's goals. At Code Canyon, you will find a massive library that contains thousands of JavaScript and PHP components and almost 20,000 HTML and mobile templates. You will definitely find what you are looking for to take your site to the next level. The first feature that we are going to look at is the enumeration, or enum for short. This was introduced in PHP version 8.1, so it is very new to the language. And an enumeration is nothing more than a special type that has a fixed amount of constant values. Now, that's a whole lot of technical jargon thrown into one sentence, so let's just look at some code. To create an enum, you use the enum keyword followed by the name of the type that you want to create. And remember that whenever you are creating an enum, you are creating a data type. That's very important, and that's one of the reasons why you would want to use an enum. And a very easy analogy to use is the HTTP request types, get, post, put, delete, all of those. And the reason is because each one of those values is an HTTP method, but it is a very simple value. It's not really something that can be represented in code by a class or anything like that. It would be a constant value. So an enum is kind of like a collection of similar constant values. In this case, it's an HTTP method, so that we would have a case of get, a case of post, a case of put, and whatever else that we wanted to check for inside of our application. And we could essentially do the same thing for the HTTP status. That's also something that would be easily represented by an enum, so that we can have a case for OK, and a case for method not allowed. But one thing about the HTTP status codes is that they are a code. We, of course, use OK and method not allowed and unauthorized, but they have an actual numeric value. So you can back an enum with an integer value. You can also back it with a string value if you wanted. In the case of an HTTP status, it makes a whole lot of sense to use an int here. So for the OK case, we could use the value of 200. For the method not allowed, well, that is a status code of 405. Now, I know that this seems like a lot of code to be writing to represent constant values. I get that. But just bear with me here, because the key thing about enums is that these are data types, and you're going to see why that is such an important thing. Now, an enum is not a class, but it has a lot of class-like features. It cannot have properties, but it can have methods. It can also have static methods. So let's say that we want to define a static method for the HTTP method, and we could call that simply getCurrent. The idea being that we want to get the current HTTP request type. So this code is going to probably look very familiar to you because we've probably all written it, to where we need to get the request method from the server. And then we just need to do some comparisons. Now, unfortunately, here we have to use string values, but this is really the only place that we have to do that, because we aren't going to return the actual request method value. We are going to return one of the cases from our HTTP method enum. So in this case, we return get, and for post and put, we return the appropriate case. But remember I said that this is a data type, so we can use type hints here. We can say that this getCurrent method is going to return an HTTP method case. So that means whenever we need to handle that type of request, we can use this getCurrent method to give us the current type of request so that we can then handle that. So let's type a function called handleRequest. And in a typical application, we would just have a string value coming into this function. And, that's all well and good, but it's a string value. It can be anything. And so inside of this function, we would need to validate and be sure that we have an actual HTTP method value. But with an enum, we can use a type hint. We can ensure that the data coming into handleRequest is an HTTP method. And we could also ensure that, hey, this is going to return some kind of response. So it is going to return an HTTP status. And let's say that our application is only going to handle GET requests. So that makes this very easy to do, so that if the incoming request is a GET request, then of course we want to return an HTTP status of OK. Otherwise, we don't handle that particular type of method. So we can just return the method not allowed case from our HTTP status. So let's use that function then. We'll just echo out the value. However, the case is not something that can be converted to a string. What we want to do is use the actual backing value. Remember that the HTTP status has an integer backing value. So everything should work. We can go to the browser, we can refresh, and there we can see we have a value of 200. Let's say that we only want to handle put requests. That wouldn't be a very useful application, but we can do that so that if we make a GET request, then, well, that one is not allowed. Now, one thing I'm sure you noticed is that I didn't use the exact casing for the enum names. So here you can see that HTTP method is, well, that's not right. And then here HTTP status is all lowercase. And that's because the enum name is a lot like a class name. It is case insensitive. However, the case or the value, whatever you want to call it, that is case sensitive. But this is also where enums are very useful, because if we mistype one of the case values, well, PHP is going to tell us that there is a problem there. So I always think of enums as a tool for developers. It's something that makes our lives easier. Yes, it can require a little bit of setup, but when it comes to developing an application, especially a large application, it can make our lives so much easier. Our next feature was introduced with version 8.0, and it is the class constructor property promotion. That is a mouthful to say for something that is relatively straightforward. This allows us to automatically create class properties and initialize them with values. So let's first of all look at what a class would typically have looked like before version 8, to where we would have our explicit property definitions. And a guitar is a lot like a car in that it has a make and it has a model. And of course, we want to provide that information through the constructor. And inside of the constructor, we would take that information and simply initialize the appropriate values. And for small classes, of course, this isn't a whole lot of work, but for large classes, yeah, this could take a while. And really, even for small classes, I mean, we've done this so many times, it can be rather tedious. And so the class constructor property promotion allows us to do this. We can use the access modifier before the name of a parameter, and behind the scenes, PHP is going to automatically create that property and assign it the value that was passed to it. So by simply saying public string make and public string model, this automatically creates the properties so we can get rid of those definitions. Then we can also get rid of the initializations for those properties, because that is automatically done for us as well. So our class definition becomes rather clean and concise. And the beautiful thing about this feature is that we can mix and match. If make needs to be public and model needs to be private, that's perfectly fine. We can do that. Or if we want make to be automatically created, but we want model to not be, we can also do that as well. So it is not an all-in type of feature. We can opt in to use it whenever we need to. And this is going to lead us to our next feature, which was introduced in 8.1, and that is simply read-only class properties. And this is very descriptive as to what it is. It allows us to create read-only properties. A read-only property is a property that cannot change after it is initialized. And the way that we do that is by using the read-only keyword. So in this case, let's make model read-only. We would say public read-only followed by the type of the value. Now, the type has to be there. If you omit the type, it is going to give you an error. So you need the type followed by the property name, and there you go. It doesn't have to be public. It can be private. It can be whatever you need it to be. And so let's go ahead and see what happens whenever we try to change that value. Of course, we first of all need a guitar object. So let's create a PRS McCarty. PRS is short for Paul Reed Smith. And of course, the model is the McCarty model. I guess we could be a little more specific because there are different McCartys, but that's neither here nor there. So we want to try to change the PRS McCarty model to, let's say, Avella. And in the browser, we are going to get an error. We cannot modify read-only property guitar model. And that makes perfect sense because we initialized it with the value. We therefore cannot change that value. And read-only properties are very important because it introduces immutability. And the more immutable stuff that we use, the less bugs that we introduce to our applications that involve mutating data. Replacing data is a whole lot safer than mutating it. So we want to make the make property read-only, and we can do that very easily by just including read-only in our class constructor property promotion so that the make parameter is public read-only string make. And once again, if we try to modify that now, we are going to run into an error. So let's just go ahead and prove that. And now our error is going to change because we cannot change the read-only make property. And while we're here talking about classes, let's talk about another feature. This was introduced in version 8.0, and that is the stringable interface. And this is an interface that we can, of course, apply to a class so that we could use its objects as a string value. Like, for example, if we wanted to just echo out the PRS McCarty, whenever we view that in the browser, we get an uncaught error that object of class guitar could not be converted to a string. Well, we can fix that by defining a very special method called underscore underscore toString. And of course, we need to return a string value from this. So let's just output the make and the model. And you know what? Let's also include a private property. Let's make this read only. And this can be the cost of the guitar. We, of course, need to pass in that value. I don't really know what that is off the top of my head, so I'm just going to pick 4,000, and we will have that cost. So remember that in the browser, whenever we just tried to output that object, we got an error. Now, by defining this toString method, behind the scenes, PHP is going to automatically call that method because we are trying to use this object as a string. And now we get a syntax error. And that's because I forgot the $sign for the variable. So we'll fix that. And there we go. We have the string value. Now, a lot of times you might see this to where it is being coerced into a string so that it's more explicit as opposed to implicit. Really, it doesn't matter. The results are going to be the same. So it's going to be up to you to decide whether or not you're going to use that type of style. Just be consistent with whatever you do. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it and want to see more, then be sure to subscribe to the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel. And of course, if you want to learn more, be sure to check out the other fantastic videos and tutorials that Envato Tuts Plus has to offer. I am Jeremy, and I will see you next time.